Let's take a look at Angular, and you could ask yourself, why Angular? Because there are millions, billions of people all over the world who don't use Angular and who are perfectly happy, reasonably happy, and even if they are miserable, I guess Angular won't change that. But if you are a web developer, then Angular might make your life less miserable. In order to see how Angular works, let's take a look at the way a web application works. You have your web server, and there you have some kind of programming language. In this case, it's PHP. And this programming language will generate HTML pages. These pages get sent to your browser, and the browser will show this HTML page to the user. Now, in order to create an HTML page, you have to know your HTML, your CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. Not very complicated. You can probably paste it from, copy and paste it from Stack Overflow, because what are you going to do with this JavaScript code? You're going to check the input of the user. Maybe you're going to add some animation, and that's about it. Rather simple JavaScript code. Now, there's also another way that you can use your web application. You could also use AJAX. When you're using AJAX, your server doesn't send your HTML page to your browser. It will just send the data to your browser. And then, of course, your JavaScript will become more complicated, because now your JavaScript must also process this data, retrieve the data, and insert it in the DOM tree. So that means you will have rather complicated JavaScript code. AJAX wasn't used that often when you created a web application, but things have changed rather recently, because nowadays web applications are not only consumed by browsers, but also by mobile devices. And mobile devices often use apps, and apps have their own user interface, so they don't need the HTML page, they just need the data. In this case, it's the word welcome that is sent to my app, and that will be shown by the app. And so maybe it's a good idea for your web server to send the same data to an app for a mobile device and to your browser. And that's the reason, of course, why AJAX is becoming more and more important. The way your server will send this information to these two clients is by using REST APIs, or maybe another technique, but REST API is rather frequently used. And so that means that on your browser side, you will need more complicated JavaScript. And so in order to help you write this complicated JavaScript, maybe it's a good idea to use a JavaScript framework. Angular is not the only JavaScript framework you can use. React.js, Vue are also possibilities, but in this case, of course, we're looking at Angular. Now let's see what this means, using Angular to work with a web application, to use Angular in your browser, etc. This is a rather ugly but fairly typical HTML page, and an HTML page has a layout. You will have your header, you have your footer, you have your main area, and you have a sidebar maybe. Some people compare this layout to the rooms in your house. Now, in your rooms, you probably have furniture. And furniture, that will be your components in your web page. You will have a menu, you might have a list, a form, a table. And just as you can move furniture from one room to the other in your house, you should also be capable of moving a component to another place, reusing it somewhere else, maybe also in another web page. And that means that this component should be very independent, because that's the only way that you can reuse it. That was the outside of your web application, but now let's take a look at the inside. Let's take a look at the HTML code. This is the HTML code that was used to generate this aside with the list. Now, this part is in fact the part that should become our component. The aside is part of the layout, but the UL and the LI tags are part of your component. Now, it would be nice to have to see that we can use a component in our HTML. In this case, we've created a new element, app-list, and when we're using Angular, we can use this in our HTML page. So the HTML page will look like this. We will still have our aside, and there we have the app list. Now, when we just have this app list here, then this app list will always create item 1, item 2, item 3. Maybe it's a good idea to make the furniture, make the components more flexible. This app list component should also be able to show other texts. Let's say we have a JavaScript function, getItems, and this JavaScript function returns an array with 3 names. We want to use this information in the component, so we have to make our component more flexible, and we do that by adding attributes to our app list. In this case, the attribute is called data. You can give it any name you like, and maybe a bit special compared to the HTML attributes is that we use square brackets around the attribute name, but that's just for Angular. But here you can see that the contents of this data attribute is equal to the return value of getItems. And when we do it like this, we will see that our component will show the 3 names instead of item 1, item 2, and item 3. As an aside, the name Angular comes from the Angular brackets that are used to denote a component. So your open and your close Angular brackets. The technique we're using here is called data binding. We have data in our JavaScript code, and we're binding this data to the DOM tree. It's even live data binding, because when we change the data in JavaScript, the HTML page will also show this changed data, this new data. To end this presentation, we're going to take a look at the Angular architecture, simplified Angular architecture. Let's start with a component. That's something you know. A component is something which we use to show something in the HTML page. And in Angular, this component has metadata, extra data, extra attributes which are added to the component, which tell us something more about the component. Now, a component only contains JavaScript code. We also need HTML, and that is provided by the template. Component and template, they belong together because a component will send data to the template. It's called property binding. So when we have data in the component, it will be shown somewhere in my template. Template will contain HTML code. Now, something which we haven't seen yet is that we can also have a data flow going from the template to the component. So the other way around. It's called event binding. Let's say the user clicks a button in my template, and I have a function in JavaScript that can react to that. Well, then I can bind that function to this onClick event, just as you can do in ordinary JavaScript code. So these are the 2 data flows you have in your component. You can send data from your component to your template. That's data that is shown in your HTML page, but you can also bind a function to an event that occurs in your template. Now, sometimes you have code that doesn't need a user interface. When we take a component, a list component, which we saw before as an example, the information from this component, to item 1, item 2, item 3, probably comes from your server. Now, of course, you can write JavaScript code in your component to fetch this information from the server, but a component should follow the single responsibility principle. A component is responsible for showing data on the screen and not for fetching data from the server. So that is the reason why we put this special JavaScript code in a separate class. In this case, it's called a service. A service is JavaScript code in Angular that doesn't have a user interface. Probably is used to get some information from a server, to send information to the server, etc. The last part in this simplified overview of the Angular architecture are directives. Directives are used in a template, and we can use them to add programming constructs to our template. Let's say in my template I want to create HTML code that will show a table when there is data and doesn't show a table when there isn't any data. An if construct. Well, there is a directive for that, an if directive. If we take a look at the list which we saw previously, the different items that were shown, well, I can use a loop for that. For each item in the list, I want to generate an li tag. That's a for loop. That's also an example of a directive. So here we have the three parts which are important in the Angular architecture: component and a template. We have the service and we have the directive. And this is the drawing or the image which is very important to think of when we go look at how Angular really works.